Phoenix like stabs this demon that's moving too quick for her to see. That followed a group of female friends who consume various boy parts. It's very refreshing to read somebody who just can write so good. It was like the author couldn't think of an adverb, so she just like said the verb over and over again 3 times. I don't know, it was weird. What is up, guys? Welcome back to another video. Guillermo is moving the chair. So this may be the first time that I'm doing a little 2-for-1 book wrap-up because June was absolutely insane for me. I did a lot of travel in June. I did like 3 states in 3 weeks, and as fun as it was, it kind of took a lot out of me socially and I wasn't really able to focus on my reading. So we are doing June and July books today. So this is our little June-July stack. I have my handy dandy reading journal, so let's jump right in. All right, first up is one from my Reading Around the World challenge that I did very much enjoy for Albania. So this is Ismail Kadare's. I never remember before I sit down to do these videos to look up the pronunciations of these names, but this is the Palace of Dreams. So we have kind of a thin little book here with a really cool concept. This one ended up being 3.5 stars. Are you gonna stay back there the whole time? It's pretty short and it actually could have been longer. It's only 200 pages. I feel like we could have dived so much deeper into this concept. Essentially, our main character starts to work at this palace, the Tabir Sarail. Again, I could be mispronouncing it, but that's like the name of the palace. And basically it is his and many other people's jobs to go through and read transcriptions of dreams and to try to figure out what dreams could potentially either lead to some great discovery or invention, or could lead to them kind of preventing like a war or something. So basically they view dreams as potential prophecies. So very cool concept. I'm here for it. I loved it. I thought it was really interesting because you have this very like the dichotomy of like working in a cubicle like at a 9-to-5 job, but then doing this really intense abstract kind of work. The characters are literally plumbing the depths of the citizens' psyches. Like it's really fascinating, and I'm somebody who, I've said this before, I don't always love a book that is very like dreamy and not super like tactile and kind of abstract and more like a concept than like an actual physical tangible thing, but this was done really well. There's like a tactileness to it that made it really easy for me to understand. What's really interesting is this book was banned like immediately upon its publication in Albania, which I think says something for like a book's literary value. If a country is banning it, I feel like it's because there's actually something really important there. Now, the reason why I only gave it 3 stars was I feel like there was a lot that was sort of underexplored. It was a little bit choppy, very simple sentences. I feel like it could have been, and maybe that's like it's on the translator, not necessarily the author. It could have even been better if it had been longer. Not without its flaws, but I did really like this. Moving right along, we have a favorite of June. So I have read Robin Wall Kimmerer before. I read Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a beautiful medley of personal anecdotes and kind of autobiography mixed with like science, because she's a biologist, and like Native American wisdom. It's absolutely gorgeous. I loved that one more than I liked this one, but I still wanted to read this. It is called Gathering Moss. Much shorter than Braiding Sweetgrass and still very scientific, not quite as much of like the personal anecdotal stuff in this, which I think is actually why it's kind of lacking. I ended up giving it 4 stars. I still really liked it. I definitely view mosses in a different way now. I've actually been like pouring water onto like a random little patch of moss that's out. It gets baked in the sun a lot, and I'm surprised it's made it as long as it has, but I don't want it to die and get all dried out because obviously mosses need to be very wet. They need a lot of water. And so I've been like watering that patch of moss when I water my plants, and that was definitely only because I read this book. This was full of gorgeous little nuggets. Something that Kimmerer does really, really well is taking like a very specific thing that she's talking about, so like moss, for example, but then pulling it out into this macro perspective where she's now commenting on like nature or humanity or life as a whole, but using something like moss as a metaphor. It's so beautiful. So even though she's talking about very specific things all related to moss, the themes in here get very big. So like she ends up talking about ownership, the human ego, the balance of nature, this idea of reciprocity she brings up a lot, which I love, this idea of like giving back to nature, not just taking. Sacred knowledge, like Native American knowledge, something about it that just feels so wholesome and lovely and wonderful, and it does good for the soul. So that was Gathering Moss. Oh yeah, next up was an audiobook. I really enjoyed this one. I gave it 4 stars. This was Chlorine by Jade Song. So this is about a girl, kind of done in the style of maybe like Mona Awad, where you kind of don't know exactly if something is really happening or if it's just happening inside the mind of like an unreliable narrator. But a preteen girl, she's a swimmer, she's like super competitive. Her coach is really harsh on her, and she starts to turn into a mermaid or think that she turns into a mermaid. Essentially, she is going through puberty. Like she kind of gets her period for the first time, and it's more so I feel like a metaphor for her body transforming and her becoming a woman. Lots of themes around the female body, for sure. Lots of themes around pressure from family, pressure put on athletes, parental expectations, sapphic love, mental health. It's got a lot of really interesting themes in it, so I did really enjoy this one. It's one of those books that obviously can be interpreted different ways. Like you could literally interpret it, or it could just be more of a metaphor. So I think it's fun when you can read a book like 2 different ways, like through 2 different lenses. And so I really liked this one. So that was Chlorine. Next, briefly, I'm going to mention another audiobook, but it was a DNF. It was not my favorite. This was A Touch of Jen by Beth Morgan. The concept is we have a couple, Remy and Alicia. They're obsessed with this jewelry designer named Jen. She somehow ends up, even though they've only known her through social media, like through Instagram, she invites them to the Hamptons. Like somehow they end up, that was like the first ridiculous thing that happened, was like they end up in the same place at the same time. Anyway, their obsession grows and then it takes literal form in like the form of a sinister creature. I think that's how it's described in the blurb. And so the couple finds themselves in this like alternate reality where their jealousy and their envy like becomes incarnate, like it becomes like a literal thing. Made it like halfway through and stopped. So it could have like picked up and gotten really crazy and kind of speculative as soon as I stopped. But that was part of the reason why I picked it up, was because I was like, oh, it has this cool sort of speculative like element to it. It just wasn't holding my attention. The characters were so flat. They didn't really have any like distinguishing attributes to them because they're just so obsessed with this woman. Lots of like random tangents and random dialogue that didn't feel related to the plot at all. I mean, I definitely understood the sort of millennial social comedy aspect of it that the blurb does talk about. So it hits the mark in that sense, I guess. But yeah, I quit before I could get to the psychedelic horror elements. So maybe I just didn't hold on for long enough. If you guys have read this one, you can let me know if I just quit too soon. Basically, it's supposed to be sort of a commentary on like hidden desire, but I didn't get to the end of it, so I have no star rating for it. So anyway, that was A Touch of Jen. Next was another audiobook DNF. I don't know what was going on with me. This one I had such high hopes for. The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. I freaking loved The Monk and Robot duology by Becky Chambers. Obsessed. Love it. Cozy sci-fi, solar punk sort of subgenre. Those books are brilliant. I love them. So I had high hopes for this because it's from the same author. The concept was, or the synopsis was, Rosemary is our main character. She joins this motley crew of aliens on a spaceship called the Wayfarer, and they're basically exploring outer space. So it's like this space adventure type book. And then she kind of gets more than she bargains for because the captain accepts this job tunneling wormholes through space. So it's like it ends up being like a found family space opera, which sounds lovely. And it's insanely creative, don't get me wrong. It's a rollicking ride. It was a fun time for the first 7 hours because it's a 14-hour audiobook. So I listened to like 7 hours of this audiobook. Definitely if you love like outer space, alien type, you know, like descriptions of all these different crazy alien type creatures like Star Wars, you know, vibes, like it was cool for that aspect for sure. Lots of lovable characters, but for me, the story just slowed way down. An insane amount of world building, and I know that this is a series. I think there's 3 of them. So maybe it was sort of like kind of an info dump world building type of situation in the beginning, which does happen with some series. I totally get why some authors feel like they have to do that because they're trying to like explore the world and explain the world really quickly in the first book, and so that they can get to like more intricate stuff, I guess, in the second and third books. Every time we were introduced to either a new character or some new concept, we had to spend pages and pages and pages describing that thing in detail. Becky Chambers is insanely creative. The fact that she can describe everything in such detail, like the way that the ship works and all the different jobs of all the different aliens, and you know, the backstory of all of them and the planets that they came from and the type of, you know, people and life forms on those planets. It's cool, but it was just a lot of extraneous detail to the point where I felt like we were losing the plot a little bit. I think my brain just needed something that moved a little bit swifter, and this did not. But it was just to the point where it was kind of silly. And when I read sci-fi, I don't want it silly. I don't know if that makes any sense. And that could be the reason why it becomes your favorite book. But for me, it was just not. It just wasn't doing it for me. So unfortunately, that was a DNF. Then comes my beach read. So this is a Julia Armfield short story collection. I read her for the first time. I read Our Wives Under the Sea the first time that I was in Florida. And so when I went back this year to Florida, I was like, let me read another Julia Armfield. So I read Salt Slow. Thoroughly enjoyed this. This was 4 stars, solid 4.5 stars. We get a lot of sort of like genre bending short stories in here. We get a little bit of horror, science fiction, mythology, feminism, all sorts of fun things kind of like all cobbled together. And then they each had like a speculative element to them. They were a lot of fun. It's rare that I find a short story collection where there's not at least 1 or 2 that I'm like, that wasn't that great. These were all good. Like every single one of them had something really unique about it. The first one I think is called Mantis. It was really fun. It's about a girl basically like going through puberty, but she transforms into like a boy eating praying mantis. I thought that one was really fun. The Great Awake involves like nearly every single person in a city becoming an insomniac, and so it was like kind of exploring like what that would do to people and what that would do to a city if like nobody had to sleep anymore. The Collectibles was really interesting. That followed a group of female friends who consume various boy parts, either for sport or out of necessity. I wasn't sure. You never find out, but I thought it was fascinating nonetheless. I loved it. I think Julia Armfield is quickly becoming an auto-buy author for me. I need to see if she has anything else, because if she does, I need to get it. So highly recommend this one for sure. Next was one, I still don't know how I feel about this one, because it could have gone a lot of different ways. Like this concept in the hands of like different authors would just look totally different. This is Venomous Lumpsucker by Ned Bowman. So it's set in the near future. It is a satire, by the way, which isn't always my favorite thing, but I thought this was done really well. And it explores the aftermath of like basically our response to climate change, but like we failed big time. And so we have 2 main characters, Halliard and Ressaint. They have totally different jobs, but they're thrown together to search for the venomous lumpsucker, this ugly little fish that may already be extinct along with like millions of other species. We're not totally sure in the beginning. And so we travel with them. Anyway, they uncover this like stock market scam that's put on by like the global elites, basically, we assume, that really kind of makes this novel feel believable. We sort of have like evil corporations, you know, people like actual biologists trying to save species, even if it's like an ugly species. Now, it definitely waxes poetic about the climate crisis. Honestly, more times than I could count. Like it's very much kind of the author, by way of his characters, philosophizing about our current state. But it does feel really timely, honestly, depressingly accurate. to how indifferent society has kind of become to different species going extinct. I mean, we're kind of just now seeing that. And then, so this obviously takes place like several decades in the future where that's like a very normal thing, like thousands of species are going extinct every single day. And we have basically, humanity has just become sort of numb to it. So Halliard is a mining executive, and he's a lot more concerned with money. And then Resent is the animal cognition specialist. So she's the one who actually cares about the animals. She is very much like the beating heart of the novel. Like her character is definitely kind of what makes it worth reading. Overall, the concept was really creative. This idea that like corporations could buy extinction credits, but it all being kind of a scam was very accurate to how I could see things actually going in the future, unfortunately. I wasn't like super satisfied with the ending. It gets pretty wacky by the end, I'm not gonna lie. It gets very almost like Matrix-y by the end of it. It was worth a read. What did I give it? I gave it 4 stars. It's a solid 4 stars. Very creative concept. So I did really like that. Another Reading Around the World book. This was for Algeria. It came out in French, because this is Camus' The Outsider. But I've read for France, but I can't remember why this was supposed to be for Algeria. Maybe he's from Algeria. Anyway, if you have somehow missed the Camus boat, which I did, so maybe you did too. This is about Merceau. He's our main character. Something happens kind of very randomly. He commits this act of violence that is very seemingly unlike him, because he's not like generally a violent person. And it flips his life completely upside down, and now he is being sentenced to potentially either like time in prison, life in prison, to death. We don't know. It's basically like him, like his trial. So the first half is like leading up to this big event, and then the second half is him kind of figuring out what's gonna happen to him, like waiting for his fate to be decided. The whole concept around this is that he is just somebody who refuses to conform. That's why it's called The Outsider. He sort of exists outside society in the sense that like his mother dies at the very, very beginning, so that's not a spoiler. And he doesn't really show like proper emotion. He says something at one point like nothing in my life really changed because of her death, so he just doesn't really show the emotion that people would like expect him to show. So he seems kind of like a sociopath because he's not crying at his mother's funeral. So when this event happens and he's not really showing any remorse, he kind of comes off to the court and the jurors like a sociopath. So there's a lot in here about like how he experiences prison. He says, a man who had only lived for a single day could easily live 100 years in prison. He would have enough memories to keep him from getting bored. In one respect, it was an advantage. So he has this like weird positive perspective of being in prison. He's able to kind of like see the positives in things, even though his life very quickly looks like it's just going down the toilet. Some of these one-liners just really got to me, and I think that's probably why this book is like so famous and like Camus is really famous, is because there's one line that just kind of comments on like sort of the absurdity of life and like where it can take you. He says, as I waited for the new day to dawn, I found myself back in my cell. It was as if the familiar paths etched in the summer skies could just as easily lead to prison as to innocent sleep. So it's kind of like he has no idea how he got here, why life is happening to him. It's just kind of like a commentary on like the absurdity of life. At times, I honestly did truly wonder if he was like a sociopath, because he does not seem to connect to his emotion like at all. Like he seems genuinely incapable of like reaching within the depths of his self. But then like his inner dialogue and his thoughts would reveal something was like very astute and very kind of deep, and I was like, oh, okay, no, like he definitely is just like a man who is in the wrong place at the wrong time. So this was really an interesting interrogation of sort of one man's contemplation of his own life and what seems like maybe a very sure death sentence. It was a really good book for anybody going through kind of an existential phase, and I feel like I'm kind of going through that where I'm contemplating a lot about like God and religion and afterlife and the point of life, and like we all have moments in life or like sort of phases where we go through like questioning all of these really big things, like why we're even here. And I feel like in a very short number of pages, he gets to that very quickly. So I did like The Outsider. I gave it 3 stars. All right, 2 more books. No, 3 more. Sorry, we're nearly there. Next up was one that I know a lot of people are probably going to get mad at me for, but I just didn't really enjoy most of my time. I enjoyed it most of the time, but it just, I don't know. It's The Serpent and the Wings of Night. So let's just get into it. This is the first in a series. This follows our main character, whose name was Araya, and she's a human surviving in a world of vampires. So she was rescued from her like burnt down village when she was very little by basically like the king of the vampires, and he kind of whisked her away to his castle, and that's where she's lived, mostly protected from the many vampires who she's always grown up surrounded by. So we have 3 like warring clans of vampires, named very creatively House of Night, House of Shadow, and House of Blood. She enters this tournament. So this is very much like a mix between the Hunger Games, Twilight, and City of Bones. So if you liked those 3 things, which I did like those 3 things when I was like a teenager, but anyway, it's like a mix of those 3 things. So there's something called the Kajari, and it's this big tournament. There's like 5 different phases, and the winner gets to, basically they get a wish granted from the goddess. Anyway, so during these 5 trials, she meets Rain, who's a turned vampire, and they are kind of forced to partner up, and then they fall in love. I originally started reading this because I wanted to read like a romantasy, but I had some problems with this. So we don't even get into the romance until like well into like the halfway point. So we're like 250 pages into this book before there's even like a lingering glance across the room. And I don't mind like a slow burn or a slow build, but I just didn't have the patience to wait for that, because like, you know, from the blurb that it's gonna happen, so I just felt like it took forever to get there. And then I was very confused at the fact that, so I'll reveal just a little bit because it happens fairly early on in the very first trial. There's like these demon things that are moving around so quickly in this arena that she can barely see how fast they're moving. And then she, who literally describes her own self as like a weak human, manages to like very easily just like kill one of these demons with a sword. She's just like, and she like she just like stabs this demon that's moving too quick for her to see, and she just like stab and it dies. Like, there was just weird things like that where I'm like, that's not consistent. If they're moving too fast for you to see and you're just a normal human who has like a little bit of basic like knife training, how do you just like stab a demon that easily? Like, it should have been harder for her, basically. That would have made it a lot more believable. And she goes out at night and she's like a vigilante, and she like protects people who are like about to be attacked by vampires. It's like so crazy to me to think that she would be alive at all, because she's constantly talking about how she, like, her main weakness is that she is a human at all. I think the main thing that I didn't love was this reads like YA, and I thought I was reading more like a new adult type book because the protagonist is 23, and it just read very, except for the spicy scenes when you finally get to them, those are very much like PG-13, but until we get there, it's like very basic. Also, I think it could have been shorter, and that's not necessarily on the author, that's more on the editor. Like, I feel like they should have cut a lot down. And you're wanting to read it because of that Hunger Games aspect, because that's a big part of like the blurb is telling you like, there's these 5 trials and, you know, she has to win and da-da-da. The trials themselves, like the actual page count of those like scenes when she's in one of the trials is a very short amount of time. And I feel like most of the time we're just like hanging out at the little castle or whatever, or the big castle where they're like staying in between the trials, training for them. Most of it's just like that sort of in-between random dialogue. The author would like repeat a word like 3 times instead of just like picking a more descriptive, better word. Like, she would say like, and she ran and ran and ran, or it bled and bled and bled. It's like, just say it bled profusely. It was like the author couldn't think of an adverb, so she just like said the verb over and over again 3 times. I don't know, it was weird. Oh, she literally tells Rain to snap out of bloodlust. It's like, he's like in this craze where he's like, there's like fresh blood and stuff, and she literally goes, snap out of it, and like he does, which is like, I ended up giving it 3 stars, because I mean, at least it it holds up. It's still like, you know, a solid plot, and I was able to follow it. It was almost a DNF, like very nearly a DNF. I sped read the last half. Not exactly what I was looking for, I think. I just need something that's more of like an adult romantasy, like Outlander or A Discovery of Witches, books like that. So if you guys have recommendations, then please let me know. We are finally at the end. So this is another Reading Around the World book for Austria. This time it is 6 stories by Stefan Zweig. I think I'm saying his name right. This was really good. These were like excellently written, like insanely good. And that's down to the author, but also the translator did a very good job, Jonathan Katz. I thought these were, all of them were really excellent. If you need like a lesson, like a master class in the short story, he would be somebody who you need to read. He does character so well, he does setting so well. He uses really like beautifully poetic language, but in a way that's like actually meaningful and doesn't feel like it's like running on and on forever, but it's also not like how I was taught to like write short stories in like university when I was like getting my English degree. It was like short stories, like every word counts, you have to be super economical, every sentence needs to like drive the plot forward. And this was not like that. It was not economical. He uses words, he's pretty verbose, and he does use words very generously, and the stories are better for it. So we had a couple in here that they were just okay. I mean, they were well written, but they didn't like, the plots didn't necessarily grab me. Highly recommend Leporella. This is a really fascinating study on character. The way that she is described physically, emotionally, intellectually, her backstory, it's so good. Like, I had such a clear picture of her in my mind. He captured her so clearly. She's basically a maid who, she's described as being like dumb as a horse, but she can work really well. She's like a workhorse, and she ends up like, I'll just spoil it. She ends up like killing the wife because he keeps the Baron, like her master, keeps complaining about the wife. There's another story called, the longest one, it's called The Buried Candelabrum, and it's about a group of Jewish men going after the stolen menorah. There's like a big time jump, and then so they find it, they rescue it from like Roman soldiers who've stolen it. It takes place in like Roman times in the year like 455. The first line of that one is, "It was the 3rd afternoon hour on a bright June day in the year 455. Starts in the Colosseum in Rome. It felt like a saga, like that one went on and on, but it felt like literally it felt like reading like a whole biblical allegory. Like the language was just so big and like important feeling. I loved all the stories. They all had something special to offer. So if you are doing this challenge or you just wanted to read a translated work, I love this copy. This is a Penguin Modern Classics copy. It's very refreshing to read somebody who just can write so good. Like he just writes so well. Every single line is like so well thought out. You can tell it was just like he was writing in like the 20s and 30s, and you can tell there's just a certain vibe to it and a certain like charm. So yes, I thoroughly enjoyed all 6 of those stories. And then finally, briefly, I will mention an audiobook that I DNF'd. This was Organ Meats, which sounds like, the concept sounds like I would be all over it. Like when I read the synopsis on Spotify, because I listened to it on Spotify, I was like 1,000 times yes to all of that. It sounds amazing. It sounds so fascinating and so creative. But I got about halfway through and stopped and just ended up like going on YouTube and finding somebody who had done a review and like summarized the rest of the book so that I didn't have to listen to the rest of it. It's one of those books written in such an abstract way that the writer is trying to make every single sentence a metaphor, and that's just not, it's too much. My brain doesn't work that way. Like I just need a tactile description sometimes. Like you don't always have to tell me that like miles of red thread is unspooling from her body. Like it's okay to just tell me that she's bleeding out. As gorgeous as that writing can be, I couldn't keep track of what was a metaphor for what anymore. It really should have been more of a mix of like the metaphor and then more like tactile descriptions. It was a lot to try to keep track of. The story got a little crazy. There was a time jump at one point. I could kind of sort of keep track of the plot of what was going on. The audiobook was requiring like so much focus that I just needed, I think if I had had a physical book, it would have been different. So if you're gonna read this, if it sounds actually like something that you would like and you do really love heavy metaphoric language, then you should probably pick up the physical book. And I do actually have a couple more books on my TBR from this author that I will eventually get to one day. So I'm not writing the author off completely. That was a DNF, unfortunately, so I do not have a star rating for Organ Meats. All right, guys, if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what your favorite book was so far of the summer, of June or July. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye, guys.